Talofa lava, this is Pacific Waves from RNZ Pacific. I'm Susanna Susuki. Coming up, violence breaks out during a protest in New Caledonia. Also,
the stakes here are ultimately potentially nuclear conflict between two major superpowers.
Pacific states are urged to unite and hold the US and China to account. And
we're planning on upsetting a couple of those teams and trying to move forward to the next stage of the tournament.
PNG's men's cricket team prepares for the World Cup in June. Violent clashes erupted on Tuesday in New Caledonia's capital, Noumea, between security forces and pro-independence protesters who strongly oppose the Nickel Pact. Firearms, tear gas and stones were reportedly used during the clash, while protesters were blocking access roads to Noumea. I spoke with our French Pacific correspondent, Patrick de Cloyter, and began by asking him what had led to the violence.
Well, apparently the primary goal was to set up roadblocks outside Noumea in the suburbs, and in another place as well, up north, near to a mining site in New Caledonia. And apparently also what has been reported is that, especially in the suburbs of Noumea, which is the small town of Saint Louis, the demonstrators from the pro-independence side started to throw stones at the police who had been deployed there, about 50 of them. And then it sort of escalated.
What were the protests about?
Okay, that time the protest was about the opposition from a part of the pro-independence movement to the signing of an agreement, what they call a nickel pact. So obviously it's talking about nickel, and it's a French emergency assistance to the nickel industry in New Caledonia, which is in deep trouble, as we already know. And the French government was actually putting on the table something like 200 million euros in emergency assistance. And the aim of that was to allow New Caledonia's nickel industry to completely reform itself and to cut the cost of production so as to make it more competitive on the nickel world market, which is currently dominated by Indonesia, and Indonesia's nickel is much cheaper and it's produced in large quantities. That explains why some of the stakeholders, foreign stakeholders in New Caledonia nickel have recently decided to withdraw from their participation, especially in the northern nickel mine.
Were there any injuries reported from the violent clashes?
So far, what we've heard is that, and that's from the police, they say one of their female officers, who was actually a motorbike police officer, was assaulted, and her motorbike was taken away. We're not sure at which level she was injured, but that's what we've heard so far. Apart from that, obviously there would have been some minor injuries from tear gas, which has been shot from the police side because they mounted an operation to enter the village.
What has the president said about the incident or the violent clashes that we've just seen?
Well, there hasn't been any immediate reaction from the New Caledonia's president, Louis Mapu. But at the same time yesterday, on Tuesday, there were debates in the Congress of New Caledonia behind closed doors, and these was specifically focused on, here again, the Nickel Pact. And the Congress has been urged to approve that President Mapu should sign this pact as soon as possible. It's been dragging on for weeks now.
There's going to be more protests planned for this weekend. Will they also be held on Noumea? And do you anticipate that this will also lead to another outbreak of violence?
The pro and anti-independence parties in New Caledonia have already announced that for this Saturday, 13th of April, they will hold marches, obviously separate marches, to protest against, for the independent sides, they want to protest against this process, which is currently underway in Paris by parliaments to endorse this change of electoral roll, which if voted, would allow people residing in New Caledonia for more than 10 years to vote at local elections. So from the pro-independence side, they're protesting against that. They say it's like trying to dissolve the votes of the Kanak people. And on the part of the pro-France parties in New Caledonia, they want to ensure that their voice is taken into account. And they're also wanting apparently to show that not only the pro-independence parties are in a position to cause trouble or unrest. So the challenge is also on the security forces in New Caledonia to make sure, like it happened last time, there was another 2 protests at the same time on 28th of March, and there were no incidents. They want to make sure that this Saturday they keep the situation under control, and they absolutely make sure that those 2 marches will not come close at any level or at any stage on Saturday.
Pacific states at the centre of a brewing nuclear geopolitical storm are being urged to rely on diplomacy and unite with smaller states to hold the US and China accountable. An Asia-Pacific and nuclear policy expert is calling on smaller states to unite and says we are on the cusp of a new missile age in the Indo-Pacific. There's been an increase in missile testing in the region, and the US military's newest long-range hypersonic missile system could soon be deployed to Guam. Alicia Foon spoke to Stanton's senior fellow at the Nuclear Policy Program, Ankit Panda, who says smaller states aren't completely powerless, but they must avoid being caught in the crossfire of a possible nuclear conflict.
For now about half a decade, we've seen the intensification of a security dilemma and an arms race in the Indo-Pacific region. The United States is largely reacting to increased threat perceptions from China, and China in turn is reacting to the United States. So this slated deployment of the new long-range hypersonic weapon, which may happen later this year in Guam, in the Indo-Pacific, feeds into that broader pattern. So the U.S. Army has been thinking now for a number of years about how it can deliver tactical effects on the future battlefield, in effect, in the Indo-Pacific with new long-range missiles. And the broader context here is that in 2019, the United States exited a treaty known as the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which was agreed at the end of the Cold War in 1987, that used to limit the United States' ability to deploy specifically land-based long-range missiles that had ranges between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. So when that treaty ended in 2019, under the Trump administration, the United States began developing many of these new systems that are now slated for deployment to the Pacific in the coming years. So we are expecting the Army potentially later in the summer this year to announce that the weapon has reached readiness in effect and may then be deployed potentially to Guam. It is possible also that the United States will down the line discuss potential basing of either this missile or related new long-range capabilities that were built after 2019 on the soil of U.S. allies in the Indo-Pacific as well.
And is it true that this missile could potentially reach Taiwan, parts of mainland China, and even North Korea if deployed to Guam?
Yeah, so there's an interesting question about the maximum range of this missile. The U.S. Army has not declassified the maximum potential range of this system. And just given the physics involved with a hypersonic glider, it is possible that this missile will be able to range deeper than has been publicly disclosed. And the reason the Army has disclosed a maximum range of 2,775 kilometers plus maybe to avoid some of the more escalatory implications of publicly hinting that such a missile may be able to range, for instance, deep into China. But if you map that range out from Guam, let's say, you do end up covering Taiwan, but you do not actually end up deeper into China. But I do suspect that Chinese military planners will largely account for the possibility that this system could range much deeper into the Chinese mainland.
With these developments around long-range missiles, will Guam become more of a target to the likes of North Korea?
Guam would be essentially a target no matter what, in effect, because of its central importance for the United States' ability to sustain expeditionary military operations in the Indo-Pacific. But I suppose you could make the argument that Guam's strategic value more broadly to the United States is growing as a result of these new dynamics and new capabilities.
Many Pacific leaders want a Pacific zone of peace, but where it is placed geographically, is this even realistic?
Regarding your broader comment about a Pacific zone of peace, I do unfortunately think that the winds are blowing in the opposite direction. But that's not to say that smaller states, Pacific Island countries with interests in seeing their region not essentially exploited for the purposes of geopolitical competition don't have any power. To the contrary, in some of my work, I've recommended that many of the smaller states who neither see themselves as aligned formally with the United States or China can actually take a much more forward-leaning position in calling for these countries to engage in arms control talks and strategic stability discussions more broadly. Now, we don't need to be fatalistic about the possibility of a conflict in the Indo-Pacific. These capabilities are being pursued largely out of an interest in deterring such a conflict. But of course, as we learned from the Cold War, deterrence without diplomacy is only a partial solution. And so I would like to see many of these smaller states putting forward recommendations that the leaders of the U.S. and China take it upon themselves to recognize that they have a responsibility to avert war and at the same time reduce many of these dynamics that are turning the Indo-Pacific into a much more contested geopolitical and geographic realm.
How do smaller nations stand up for themselves and be taken seriously on the world stage?
Right. So, I'm not primarily talking about Pacific Island countries by themselves as a separate geopolitical unit. I was talking here more of countries, including countries in Southeast Asia. It is possible, of course, there is strength in numbers. And if Pacific Island states that do have concerns about the intensifying geopolitical storm that's brewing in Asia were to come together and identify the sources of what they see as geopolitical unease, that can actually have an effect of building pressure potentially that could then create greater incentives for China and the United States to engage in these talks. And I will say, under the Biden administration, the United States has been rather proactive in trying to engage China on arms control. But in effect, nobody's been willing to pick up the phone on the other side in Beijing. So this would also have to be something that these states see as worthy of raising on the diplomatic agenda with China, which, of course, is easier said than done with the case of particularly many smaller states that economically depend on not rocking the boat, so to speak, with either Beijing or Washington. I think there will need to be a specific call for the countries that are at the center of this brewing geopolitical storm to engage in meaningful risk reduction, arms control, and broader diplomacy to reduce the possibility of war in Asia. The stakes here are ultimately potentially nuclear conflict between two major superpowers with just existential consequences for humanity at large. And recognizing that, Asia and the Pacific, the countries need to be willing to put this on the agenda very much in the way that many European states that were caught in the crossfire between the United States and the Soviet Union were willing to do during the Cold War in Europe. Of course, there's an imperfect analogy there, given that in the Cold War context, we had two bipolar alliances, and Asia today is a much messier spaghetti bowl, in effect, of diplomatic relationships. But a similar dynamic, I do think, fundamentally.
How will the US election potentially impact what we're seeing in regards to missile launches in the Pacific region?
If Biden is reelected, I do expect we'll see more continuity, more efforts to engage China in good faith on arms control. And unfortunately, I think if Donald Trump returns, we'll see precisely the opposite in the intensification of militarism and U.S. contributions to arms racing dynamics in the Pacific.
There is no longer a casino at the resort on Iririki Island in Port Vila Harbour in Vanuatu. The new resort owners, the Dealey brothers, Brendan and Mark, didn't want anything to do with the casino. Brendan, who spoke with Don Wiseman, explained their thinking.
Iririki Island Resort is Vanuatu's largest resort, but it's also the best positioned resort in the country, and it is now the number one tourism property in the country. In years past, it used to be the same, and it's suffered through some years of management, let's call it management neglect. We picked it up after some difficult times that the previous owners had, and we picked it up on the 1st of September last year, and we've been doing huge amounts to get the resort back up and running to its best that it possibly can be, and we're well and truly on that journey, and great things are certainly happening there.
Yes, well, this big resort, as you say, it had a casino and you've closed it. What brought that on?
Yeah, well, we never bought the casino. We bought the rest of the resort back in September, but we didn't buy the casino purposely because for us, we're not fans of casinos. And we don't, for us, it doesn't stand ethically where we are as a business. And so we left it. The casino was the one part that we didn't buy, but the opportunity then came up that we could actually take over and buy the actual building of the casino, and which is what we did last week. So last week we actually bought the building of the casino, but we didn't actually buy the casino license or anything. So we only just took over the physical structure and bought the tables and chairs, so to speak, and shut down the casino. I think we're possibly the first people ever in the history of the world to buy a casino in a tax haven and then purposely shut it down on day one. So it's quite an exciting time for us.
Yes, and you feel quite strongly about this idea of the negative impact of casinos.
We always have. So we have a hotel group in Australia. Within our hotel group in Australia, we don't have any gambling. Gambling's not our sort of thing. And I know each to their own, and far be it for me to say anything about anyone in particular. And everyone has their own thoughts on things. But for me personally and for my brother and business partner, we're not into gambling and we don't like gambling. So when the opportunity came to take over that casino and then turn it into a conference centre, which is, a huge part of this. Turning it into a conference centre. Vanuatu does have conference centres. Iririki already does have a conference centre, but this will be Vanuatu's biggest and best conference centre. And it will attract conferences from all over the South Pacific, and we hope even from Australia and New Zealand as well. But, to come over for a conference now, for a big conference, 200, 300 people, we can do that at Iririki now with a conference venue like this. And the cost for people in New Zealand to do an international conference rather than a local one, people are going to find there's probably actually not that much more. By the time if you flew people from Auckland down to a local conference centre or drove or whatever, and it's not a nice, easy destination to get to. You fly into the airport, it's only 10 minutes from the airport into the centre of town, 2 minutes on the boat, and you're at the conference having cocktails, overlooking the sunset.
Well, you're doing a good sales job. If only I was booking conventions.
It's just such a magical island, such a magical place filled with amazing people. And to be able to showcase Vanuatu to people from New Zealand and from Australia, it really is a place that I think that every single Australian and Kiwi with the means should take the opportunity to come and see what is such a local place to New Zealand and Australia. It's such a short flight away, but yet it's an entirely different world.
Yes, it's a tiny island, isn't it? It's unusual in a way, given the way the resorts have developed around Awhate, that there should be such a well-established one on that little island in the middle of the harbour.
Yeah, that's right. And I think as time progresses, Iririki will get better and better and will become on the map a lot more. And I think we're going to find, I'm very confident that Vanuatu is the next Fiji. And I think that we're going to find over the next, the coming years that more and more people are going to be coming from New Zealand to Vanuatu for their holidays. If you're looking at some of these, some of the larger travel players, like Flight Centre, those travel agent sort of style operators, they're seeing huge lifts in the number of bookings coming into Vanuatu year on year this year. So, I think we're going to continue to see that over the coming years as people sort of discover how amazing Vanuatu is.
The Papua New Guinea Barramundis are going to the ICC Men's 2020 World Cup in June. They have a tough pool where the West Indies, New Zealand, Uganda and Afghanistan will be the teams to beat. Head coach Tatenda Taibu and Cricket PNG Chief Executive Richard Dorne spoke with Elias Otora about the team's preparation.
Taibu says the team is preparing well at home, working on areas they identified from a recent Asian tour where they played a total of 14 games.
The preparations have been going good. We went to India, we went to Chennai, then from Chennai we went to Oman. From Oman we went to Hong Kong, played a series there with Hong Kong and Nepal, and then we finished up our tour in Malaysia. So a total of 14 games over a month and a half, which always is great preparation when you're building up a team for a World Cup.
The team head coach believes the team can go past the pool stage at the event as they focus on becoming a well-rounded team.
We can go to the next stage. Players are really looking forward to it and are really positive, and we are all positive about getting results, especially against teams that are ranked higher than us. There are a few things that we've started working on. It's really exciting. The changing room is really happy. And once we tweak a few things on the batting, I think we'll be a well-rounded team.
While the Barramunis are ranked 19th, behind the 4th-ranked New Zealand, 7th-ranked West Indies and 10th-ranked Afghanistan, Cricket PNG boss Richard Dorne says they are going to the West Indies to compete and cause some upsets.
Of course, the big story for us this year is the Barramundis, our men's senior team, who go to the World Cup. We've got West Indies, interestingly, we've got New Zealand. We've also got Afghanistan and Uganda in that group. So we're planning on upsetting, a couple of those teams and trying to move forward to the next stage of the tournament.
Meanwhile, Donny says their pathways developed and implemented at home enables them to produce cricket players, despite the fact that rugby league is the major sport in the country.
In terms of the junior pathways, very strong. We've also introduced this year, we've gone back to having our national championships for the women and the men, both at 40 over and T20. And we're trying to develop our pathways within those regions so the kids have a clear pathway to what it's like to get to the top of the game.
That's Pacific Waves for today. To listen back, head over to rnzi.com/programs. We're also on Spotify, Apple and iHeartRadio. From myself and the RNZ Pacific team, Tō whā soifua.